Taylor Meyer sat on his porch, staring at the streetlights flickering in the cold February air. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the glass of whiskey in his hand. The house behind him was quiet, too quiet. The kids were asleep, and Deborah, well, she was somewhere, but not here. Again. It hadn't always been this way. He remembered when she used to wait for him at the door, smiling, asking about his day. Now, she barely looked at him. The late-night phone calls, the sudden changes in her schedule, the way she clutched her phone like a lifeline, it was all adding up. Taylor had tried to ignore it at first, convincing himself that it was just his imagination. But deep down, he knew. Deborah had changed. He still remembered the first time he felt it. It was a Sunday afternoon, and they were at a family barbecue. The kids were playing in the yard, his brother was grilling steaks, and the air was thick with laughter. Deborah stood across the patio, laughing, really laughing, at something on her phone. Taylor had watched her, his heart twisting. She hadn't laughed like that with him in months. When he walked up behind her, she quickly locked her phone and slipped it into her pocket, her smile vanishing. Something inside him shifted that day. He tried to brush it off, to believe that it was nothing. But the signs kept coming. The sudden late nights at work. The new perfume she never wore around him. The way she avoided his touch. The lies, the half-truths, the excuses that never quite added up. Taylor felt like he was going crazy. So he started watching. Not in a creepy, obsessive way, but in the way a husband does when he knows his wife is slipping away. He paid attention to the little things, how she always left the room to take a call, how she suddenly cared about her appearance more than ever, how she was distant even when she was right next to him. Valentine's Day was coming up, and Taylor saw it as a chance to fix things. Maybe he had been too absent, too focused on work. Maybe he hadn't shown her enough appreciation. He decided to make it special. He planned everything, reservations at the same restaurant where they had their first date, a handwritten letter, a necklace he had spent weeks picking out. He even arranged for his sister to watch the kids so they could have the night to themselves. This was going to be the night they reconnected. But then, the text came. It was the night before Valentine's Day. Deborah was in the shower, and her phone, for once, wasn't locked. Taylor wasn't the kind of man who snooped. He hated the idea of invading her privacy. But something pulled him toward it. His hands trembled as he picked it up, scrolling through the messages. And there it was. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. I'll make sure it's a night you never forget." His heart stopped. His entire body went cold. Taylor stared at the words, reading them over and over, hoping he had somehow misunderstood. But the more he read, the clearer it became. Deborah wasn't working late. She wasn't going out with friends. She had plans, just not with him. The shower turned off. Taylor quickly put the phone back, his mind racing. His heart pounded so hard he could barely breathe. When Deborah walked into the room, wrapped in a towel, she smiled at him, small, tired, forced. "Long day?" she asked, running a hand through her damp hair. Taylor swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Yeah." She kissed his cheek lightly before turning away, grabbing her pajamas. He watched her, his mind screaming at him to say something, to confront her, to demand the truth. But he didn't. Not yet. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Deborah's slow, steady breathing. His heart felt like it was being crushed. The woman he had loved for over a decade, the mother of his children, was lying to him. And tomorrow, on the day meant for love, she was going to be with someone else. Taylor had never felt pain like this before. He had spent years building a life with this woman, trusting her, believing in their marriage. And now, it was all falling apart. His mind raced with questions. Who was the man? How long had this been going on? Had she ever loved him at all? Morning came, but the ache in his chest didn't leave. He went through the motions, getting the kids ready for school, packing lunches, smiling when necessary, but inside, he was unraveling. By the time the evening arrived, Taylor had made his decision. He was going to go through with his plans. He was going to give Deborah one last chance to tell the truth. One last chance to look him in the eye and not lie. He set the table, lit the candles, and waited. And when Deborah walked through the door, everything changed. Taylor sat at the dining table, staring at the flickering candlelight. The room was set perfectly, wine glasses filled, the scent of rosemary and garlic lingering from the steak he had cooked. It should have been a beautiful evening. It should have been a night of love and laughter. But all he felt was a deep, consuming emptiness. Deborah walked in, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She froze for a split second, just long enough for Taylor to notice. Her eyes darted across the table, the candlelight reflecting in them. Then, like a mask being put on, she smiled. "You did all this?" she asked, setting her purse down. Taylor forced a smile. "Of course. It's Valentine's Day." She hesitated before sitting down, smoothing out her dress. She looked beautiful, too beautiful, dressed in a way she hadn't for him in a long time. A part of him wanted to believe she had come home to celebrate with him, that the text he had seen was nothing. But deep down, he knew. Deborah picked up her wineglass, taking a slow sip. "This is nice." Taylor studied her carefully. The way she avoided his gaze. The slight tension in her shoulders. The way her fingers drummed lightly against the table as if she wanted to be somewhere else. Somewhere with him. "So, how was work?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. She swallowed, setting her glass down. "Busy. You know how it is." "Yeah." He leaned forward slightly. "Because I called your office today. They said you left early." For the first time, her expression faltered. It was brief, just a flicker of something before she quickly recovered. She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, yeah. I had an appointment." Taylor nodded slowly. "An appointment." She shifted in her seat, reaching for her fork. "Let's just enjoy dinner, okay?" He let the silence stretch. He wanted to give her a chance. One chance to tell him the truth. But she never did. Instead, she smiled, acting as if nothing was wrong, as if she hadn't spent the day with another man. Taylor's fingers clenched around his fork. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows across her face. He had never felt so much anger in his life. Still, he forced himself to stay calm. He continued eating, nodding, pretending, letting her believe that he was oblivious. Then, her phone buzzed. Taylor watched as she reached for it almost instinctively, her fingers tightening around the device. She glanced at the screen, her lips parting slightly. A text. He didn't need to see it to know who it was from. She looked up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. And in that moment, Taylor saw the truth. She wasn't going to stop. She wasn't going to admit anything. Even with the evidence right in front of her, she was going to keep lying. Something inside him snapped. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. Deborah blinked, startled. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with forced concern. Taylor exhaled sharply. He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. His voice broke. "I know, Deborah." She froze. "Know what?" His eyes met hers, and this time there was no pretending. No acting. No more games. "I know everything." Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Deborah's breath hitched. "I don't." "Stop," Taylor cut her off, his voice low, controlled. "Just stop." Her fingers trembled around her wine glass. "Taylor, you're scaring me." He let out a bitter laugh. "I'm scaring you." He gestured wildly around the room. "I spent weeks planning this night. For you. For us. And the whole time, you've been sneaking around behind my back." She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. "I saw the messages," he continued, stepping closer. "I know about him." She flinched as if he had hit her. "Taylor, please. Tell me the truth," he demanded, his voice shaking. "Right now." Tears welled in her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about." That was it. That was the final straw. Even now, standing in the ruins of their marriage, she still chose to lie. The rage inside him boiled over. His vision blurred, his hands clenched into fists. Years of love, trust, sacrifice, it all meant nothing to her. And in that moment, he lost control. It happened fast. Too fast. 1 second, He was standing there, shaking, his heart pounding. The next, the wine glass was flying from his hand, shattering against the wall. Deborah screamed, pushing her chair back, stumbling to her feet. "Taylor, stop!" But he couldn't stop. The betrayal burned through him like fire, consuming everything in its path. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her close. "Look me in the eyes and tell me the truth," he growled. She sobbed, struggling against his grip. "Let me go." But he couldn't let go. Not after everything. Not after all the lies. The next moment was a blur. The struggle. The screaming. The desperate shoving. Then, the sickening crack. And everything went still. Deborah collapsed against the table, her body limp, her eyes wide with shock. Blood trickled down her temple, staining the white tablecloth. Taylor stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands trembled as he looked down at them, at her. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." Deborah didn't move. The candlelight flickered, casting long, dark shadows across the room. The scent of rosemary and garlic still lingered in the air. But now, there was something else. Something metallic. Something final. Taylor's chest heaved as the reality of what he had done crashed down on him like a tidal wave. And then, silence. The room was too quiet. The only sound was Taylor's ragged breathing as he stared at Deborah's motionless body. His hands shook, his vision blurred. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, anything, but his body refused to obey. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The candle on the table flickered, its warm glow casting long shadows across the blood-streaked tablecloth. The same table where they had shared meals, where their kids had laughed, where life had once felt normal. But now, it was ruined, just like everything else. Taylor stumbled back, gripping the edge of the chair to steady himself. His heart pounded in his chest, a deafening drumbeat in the silence. What had he done? His hands, his fingers, they were stained red. The sight of it made his stomach turn. He wiped them on his shirt, but it only smeared the blood further. His breath came in short gasps, his mind racing. He had to think. He had to fix this. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her still form. "Deborah," he choked out. "Deborah, wake up." Nothing. A sob tore through his throat as he pressed his fingers to her neck, searching desperately for a pulse. There had to be something. A sign. A chance. But there was nothing. His breath hitched, panic clawing at his chest. He couldn't stay here. He had to leave. But how? Where would he go? What would he do? The kids. His entire body stiffened. The kids were upstairs, asleep, unaware that their world had just shattered. Tears burned in his eyes. What would he tell them? How could he tell them? He squeezed his eyes shut, his mind spiraling. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had only wanted the truth. He had only wanted her to admit it, to stop lying. He had never meant for it to go this far. But it was too late. A sharp knock at the door sent his heart slamming against his ribs. Taylor froze. His blood ran cold. It was too soon for the kids to wake up. It was too late for visitors. So who? Another knock. Louder this time. His body moved before his brain could catch up. He wiped his face, straightened his shirt, and stumbled toward the door, his pulse roaring in his ears. His fingers trembled as he reached for the handle. He pulled it open. A police officer stood on the porch, his dark uniform blending into the night. His sharp eyes scanned Taylor's face, lingering just a second too long. "Mr. Meyer." Taylor swallowed hard. His voice barely worked. "Why, yeah." The officer shifted his weight. "Sorry to bother you this late. There was a call about a disturbance at this address." Taylor's stomach twisted. A call? Who had called? His mouth went dry. A disturbance? The officer nodded. A neighbor reported shouting. Sounded like an argument. His gaze flickered past Taylor, into the dimly lit house. "Is everything all right?" Taylor forced a smile, though his face felt like it might crack. Yeah, everything's fine. Just a disagreement. Nothing serious." The officer didn't move. His eyes darted lower, to Taylor's shirt. Taylor followed his gaze. His breath caught a dark stain. Small, but noticeable. The officer's face hardened. "Sir, is someone else in the house?" Taylor's throat closed. He needed to lie. He needed to say something, anything. But before he could speak, a sound. A sharp, muffled gasp from inside the house. The officer's eyes snapped toward the noise. "Sir, I need you to step aside." Taylor's body locked up. His mind screamed at him to stop this, to keep him out. But he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The officer reached for his radio. "I need backup at." Then he stepped inside. Taylor watched, frozen, as the officer moved toward the dining room. Toward Deborah. It felt like hours, but it was only seconds before the officer saw her. His hand shot to his holster. "Get on the ground." "No." Taylor's legs gave out beneath him. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he raised them. The officer's voice was sharp, commanding. "Don't move." But Taylor wasn't going anywhere. He couldn't. All he could do was stare as the weight of what he had done crashed down on him. The wail of sirens filled the night, growing louder, closing in. It was over. And there was no way out. Thanks for watching. Keep connect and subscribe our channel and like the videos.